Today we're going to talk about informal fallacies, basically flaws in arguments. A lot of this material comes from a book that I use in English 7, The Well-Crafted Argument. So you can go there to find more information if you like. So some terms that are going to be important and you're going to hear kind of used interchangeably throughout this discussion. An argument is a conclusion together with the premises that support it. So basically kind of like an opinion along with the reasons that support your opinion. And a premise is basically a reason or some kind of justification for why that conclusion, that opinion is important or is true. And then the term conclusion you'll hear thrown around interchangeably with claim. Also in writing, this is basically your thesis statement. But a claim is basically just a statement that generally is arguable. And the ways that we're going to look at, or the types of informal fallacies we're going to look at, are usually made in the ways that we reason. And the ways that we reason that we're going to talk about today are through deduction, induction, categorization, analogy, authorization, and plea. So let's take a look at what that means. So here's some deductive reasoning. This is one of the oldest arguments. All men are mortal is a premise. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So those two premises add up to that conclusion. In a deductive argument, the conclusion is certain. Right? There's no other conclusion that can be made from those two premises that we looked at. And so we're kind of looking to see how it came to be, how that conclusion came to be. So keep that in mind. That's what's different from induction. Is deduction, the conclusion is already certain, and sometimes we need to work backwards to figure out how it got to that way or to that point. Inductive reasoning is kind of the opposite of that. So the conclusion is not certain, it hasn't happened already, or it's not guaranteed. We are making observations to determine what is the most likely conclusion. So you can see it kind of works the opposite of deduction, in that you're making the observations first and then making some kind of likely claim or likely conclusion based on those observations. So deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning kind of work hand in hand together. So here's an example of an inductive argument. So I noticed that the local branch of a bank was robbed yesterday, and Jenny needed money to pay off her gambling debts. Also, she just bought a gun 2 days ago, and I saw her hanging around that bank that was robbed. Also, today, the people who were looking for her, because of her gambling debts, stopped looking for Jenny. So an inductive claim I could make here, based on those observations, is that Jenny robbed the bank because I saw her there yesterday. She needed money. She had some kind of motivation to do it. And she just bought a gun as well. And the people who were looking for her stopped looking. So I can maybe logically assume that Jenny robbed that bank. That's my conclusion. However, it's not 100% certain, right? That there could just be coincidences in all of that. And maybe if we added another observation that the bank has video evidence, for example, of her robbing the bank. Is there some way we could dispute that? Yes, for sure. Like I said, maybe she has an unknown twin that we don't know about, or maybe somebody doctored the video. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that just because these things are possible doesn't mean that it's likely. So an inductive claim can always be disputed, but the more evidence you can provide for it, the better the claim is. So an inductive argument is not indisputable. That's why we have that phrase, beyond a reasonable doubt, in so many inductive arguments, because again, there's not 100% certainty for any inductive claim. In this class, you're going to be writing inductive arguments. Specifically, everyone will need to write some kind of argument, classical argument. We'll take a look later in the semester, where you are making observations in the world around you, and you're putting everything together to make some kind of claim, some kind of debatable claim. And then you'll support that in an argumentative research paper at the end of the semester. If you're choosing the second option on paper 2 as well, about Troy, whether he's a hero or villain, this material will also hopefully come in handy. So how do I know when I have the right number of observations for a claim? If I'm making some kind of inductive argument? Well, that's the tricky part. Keep in mind that it's not going to be entirely indisputable. So we'll think about focusing on an efficient argument, and consider any weaknesses in your argument. And if your audience is skeptical, you want more evidence, more quotes, better anticipation of opposing views, to convince your argument. So how do we create an efficient argument? Logical structure, we're going to talk about that next week in terms of argumentative structure in forming your paper. Addressing alternative views and admitting any kind of weaknesses or flaws in your argument. And lastly, avoiding flaws in our own logic. Informal fallacies, which is what we're talking about here today. So we're going to take a close look at this third one. The other two things we'll look at next week when we talk about argumentative structure in an essay. So let's go ahead and take a look. And keep in mind you will have a quiz over these things. And you can watch the video as you take the quiz if you want. So the most common inductive fallacy, and keep in mind that a lot of these fallacies are known by other terms. If you look up logical fallacy online, you're going to find hundreds and hundreds of different types that are described. But a hasty generalization is probably the broadest category of inductive fallacy. Basically, just you're jumping to some kind of conclusion based on too little evidence. So you can see an example here. If I surveyed 12 out of 15 people on campus, and 12 of them said that they don't like Shakespeare, and then I made the claim that Las Positas College do not like Shakespeare, there's a fallacy there in that I have not surveyed enough people. It's not a large enough sample to really justify that claim. So I'd want to do more surveys. A non sequitur is basically a statement, an assertion. And an assertion is basically just making a statement with some kind of force. So a non sequitur is when you make one of those statements and it cannot be tied logically to the premise that it's demonstrating. So here's a conclusion. I deserve an A in this class, and the reason that I'm giving the premise is because I worked really hard. That premise does not naturally lead to that conclusion, although it helps for sure, but alone, just the amount of work that you do doesn't guarantee the production of an A in the class. So it's a non sequitur. It doesn't really follow. You could add more evidence to that to help you support that conclusion, but that alone isn't going to work. Ad hominem is an attack against the person making the argument, and you'll see this one a lot in politics, and frankly, you'll see a lot of these fallacies used in politics, and unfortunately, a lot of these fallacies used intentionally to mislead people in politics. So here's an example. We should not approve the education funding proposal. That's my argument, my conclusion that I'm making. And the reason is the person who wrote it is a throwback commie hippie who does yoga, a wannabe Karl Marx. So that has really nothing to do with the funding proposal. It's not really looking at the details of the proposal itself. It's just saying that the person who wrote the proposal, it's basically bad-mouthing them. So therefore we should not approve the proposal. So it really has no bearing on the funding proposal's details. So not a good argument. A red herring is basically throwing your reader off track. And again, another one that we see in politics a lot, a way to not answer a question, because answering a question might divide people and prevent some people from supporting that candidate. And I think the term red herring comes from a type of bird that was used to throw off the scent of hunting dogs when they would train them. So it kind of does the same thing in writing or in an argument. It throws off the reader. So here's an example. I understand your concern about unemployment rates. Let me tell you about my plan for lowering taxes for those in lower income brackets. Okay, it sounds kind of nice, right? But the plan for lowering taxes for those in lower income brackets isn't really addressing the unemployment rates, right? It's lowering taxes, which would be nice for someone in a lower income bracket, but it's not addressing unemployment rates. So it's a non-answer to a question. It's throwing us off the trail. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, after the fact, therefore, because of the fact. You might have heard of this one called correlation without causation. Just because two things happen around the same time does not necessarily believe or mean that the first one caused the second one. This is also known as the superstition fallacy. So here's the conclusion, an example. Black cats crossing the road means something bad is going to happen. And the reason is the last time I saw a black cat across the road, a few minutes later I fell off my bike and scraped my knee. Does the cat falling or crossing the road have any real bearing on why you fell off your bike? No. So just because one thing happened before the next does not mean the first thing caused the next thing. Two things can happen without there being a correlation between one and the other. A slippery slope argument. Another one you hear in politics a lot is basically speculation and looking at a series of events and assuming that one will lead to another, and then that'll lead to another, and then that'll lead to another. And we really don't have any evidence to base that chain on because those other things haven't happened yet. So, and we see this a lot in trying to cause fear in political advertisements, for example. So here's an example. If we legalize marijuana, we'll have to legalize all drugs, and then we'll legalize all crimes, and we'll live in a lawless world. Obviously, that's a pretty extreme one, but these type of arguments are not uncommon. So we haven't gotten to the point of legalizing all drugs, so we don't know if that would cause us to legalize all crimes, and then we don't know if that would lead us to live in a lawless world. So we haven't really gotten to any of that yet. So a slippery slope argument. Cherry picking, and this one I think is especially important to college students who are new to research. This can be a dangerous one because we like to think that what we believe is right about the world, so we go out and we cherry pick evidence that supports that. And in a research project, you want to kind of try to leave your own beliefs out of it as much as you can as you investigate the question that you're investigating, so that you're not just picking evidence that supports your hypothesis already. You're researching with an open mind. So here's an example. The conclusion is seatbelt laws don't really save lives. And here's a cherry-picked example that would support that conclusion. My friend was in an accident and she wasn't wearing her seatbelt. The officer said if she was wearing her seatbelt at the time, she wouldn't be alive because she wouldn't have been thrown from the fiery car. Okay. So like I said in the slide here, has this ever been the case? Sure, it's probably happened before, but it's very much an exception to the rule and not enough to discount all the times that seatbelts have actually saved lives. So be sure that your evidence that you're looking at is representational and not just extreme cases or cherry-picked. You might have heard the term confirmation bias. Similar thing here, right? We confirm what we believe by letting our bias influence our research. And we see this even in our selection of news sources, right? We go to news sources that tend to make us feel good about what we think rather than look at a variety of perspectives.